Hi everyone, I'm Tim Von Rueden with cgcookie.com, and in this tutorial I'm going to be talking about coloring over your line work. So I hear a lot of artists talk about how they can get to the line art phase fine, but then when it comes to laying down colors, they're not sure if they're supposed to be working underneath the line work. Do they draw right on top of the lines? And in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I would go about approaching that. So recently I was given a line work from Kent Trammell over at Blender Cookie, and they're going to be doing a tutorial about fabric and cloth, and they wanted me to color something really quick. So I was given this line art, and then immediately I knew exactly how I was going to go about treating it. So hopefully you guys will learn something in the process, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. So here's the sketch that Kent gave me, and thankfully he did it on its own layer. So then I was able to color in between the sketch layer and the background layer, which is really nice to start out. So what I'm doing here is I'm laying out some initial base colors that I know I would be using. The skin color and the yellow dress were kind of the two things Kent wanted, and then the blue I'm using as more of a neutral if I ever need to pull from it. So what I like to do is I like to ignore the whole premise of coloring within the lines, because I like to clean up the line work later, and I think that if you're so worried about sticking within the lines so early on, that limits yourself, and then you are oftentimes detailing and coloring and wasting your time because you're so paranoid about if you're sticking within the initial line art that you're actually not being very efficient at all. So I like to lay it down pretty heavy, and I like to go way outside the lines, and then later on I'll show you how you can cover that up and then make the actual silhouette of the sketch kind of come alive again. So what I like to do is I like to start off with laying that base color first, and then you have to keep in mind of where we're putting this light, and that light needs to read cohesively throughout the entire piece, because it's our job as artists to be able to lay in light sources and then have that light source kind of hit every angle of the material, of the skin, of the hair, whatever the concept may be, and have it read accurately. So what I like to do is first I like to lay my base color, so a darker color, and then I like to build up my lighting on top of that. So now is the point where I'm creating a new layer, and I'm doing it above the line art layer. So from this point forward, I'm working solely above the line art. And pretty much what I'm doing is I'm going to be alluding to the line art underneath by first covering it up and then kind of edging it out so that you can still kind of see the line art that was initially placed, but we're doing it through color and contrast, and we're going to be doing that throughout. I'm working right on top of it, and I think this is what scares a lot of artists, but don't let this scare you. Don't let this intimidate you and be like, oh no, I'm going to lose all my solid lines that I had that were really strong. Because yes, a lot of that initial line work you did, if you're covering up, you will lose some of that strength of the line art. But what you're trying to do is replace it with the strength of your color use in the way that you're building your values. So hopefully over time you'll feel more confident that even if your lines are really strong, that you'll build up even stronger color works on top. And you can see here, I'm not zooming in. That's another thing I want to really emphasize, is that you want to stay as zoomed out as much as you can until kind of near the end, or like the detailing phase. So for the face, I usually tend to zoom in, but when you're doing something like the legs or the dress that you can kind of get a good grasp on from further away, and if that's not where you're trying to direct most of the attention of the viewer, then don't worry about zooming in too much. But since I really want the viewer's attention and their eye to be drawn more to the facial region, that's why I zoom in later on and kind of detail it up there. And as I continue coloring this, I'm using Kent's black outline as sort of a guideline for me to color over, and then I'm going to use white to edge it out. So that's usually my process when I'm trying to get rid of line work is, yes, I'm going to cover it up, but then I'm going to outline it and give it that edge that it previously created with that outline. Because the way that I like to work with outlines is I don't like to have an outline at all. And I like to have the two forms, or like the background and the subject matter, be separated purely through color. And this is more of a personal preference. Like if you want to have a line separating the two, yeah, it's absolutely great, go for it. It's just all personal preference and what you kind of feel out the more that you do this. But the one thing I do try to emphasize is definitely keep that light source in mind at all times. So even with different shapes, so the shapes of the dress or her skin or whatever part that you're working on, always keep in mind where is that light source coming from, and how is this particular part of like the body or the dress, how is it angled toward the light source? Would it be catching more of the light source? Or is there something blocking the light source? Is there going to be a cast shadow that's going to be falling? These are all things that you want to be constantly subconsciously thinking of. And the more that I do this, the more that I don't have to think about it, where it does come very second nature. And it becomes a lot more fun then to color. And I think that's what might get really frustrating is even when I started out, like the first couple years, it was a little frustrating because I would always be like, well, would the light be getting under that area, or would it be, you're always second guessing and there's a lot of doubt and you're not sure if how accurate what you're laying down is because you don't have a reference. And that's why using reference when you're starting out is so important, because how else will you be able to depict an actual lighting scenario if you don't have a solid reference kind of showing you exactly what it should look like? So now from here, I'm drawing right on top of the line art layer, and some of you might be wondering, well, why don't you just hide the line art layer itself? And it would be really easy to do that, but I like to literally use it as my foundation guidelines. So from here, if there's areas that become too much where like I don't want to see any of that line art, I'll just either lower the layer's opacity or just hide the layer itself. But for the most part, I know that at the end of this piece, I can just turn the line art layer off. So up until that point, it doesn't bother me if you can see some of the line art layer, because I know that you won't be able to see it with the final piece. So now from here, I'm just going to kind of rinse, wash, and repeat the same process over and over, where pretty much I'm going through, I'm covering that line art, giving it kind of a solid foundation, and then edging it out with a white color. And in this case, I could use either a brush, but for this particular tutorial, I just used white color to be my brush tool, and then I kind of edge it out that way. So I'm just looking for different areas to quickly kind of lay out the foundation on top of the line art and then edge it out, because I'm not worrying about detailing or polishing yet. But in a little bit, I will zoom in, because up until this point, I've been avoiding the face area. And that's because I try to get a solid foundation set and focus on the areas that really aren't as detailed first, so that when I get to the detailed area, depending on how much time I have left, I'll know like, okay, since I got that done in like a half hour, I have another hour that I have to spend on wherever I like. So usually I like to get what would be considered, I guess, the unfun parts out of the way first. And since I really like working on faces and eyes and sometimes hair, then I'll be able to zoom in and be able to spend time. Now this is definitely more like client based. If you had all the time in your world, like this is a personal project, I mean, you still want to be efficient with your time management, but you definitely want to be very conscious if you're working for a client of like how you're spending your time and being able to mentally know, okay, I need to break this up into different segments and work on it like that. So now when I'm working closer up, I'm definitely relying on all the knowledge I have on like what adds value quickly to different surfaces and different shapes, and I'm applying that to the face. Now, there does come a point where I try to keep it pretty consistent in terms of how the level of detail that I'm putting throughout, and this is something you'll hear a lot of artists talk about, where you try your best not to over detail just one area while the other areas are completely unfinished. So you want to keep it pretty relatively consistent throughout until you finish the piece altogether. So this is why I emphasize having a really solid foundation to work on top of, because then I really enjoy the part where you can kind of detail and polish and make things look really nice. But up until that point, yeah, you do kind of have to go through some grunge work, making sure the lighting looks accurate, making sure the proportions work all well, and the stuff that wouldn't be considered as fun, at least in my opinion. And then once you get to this phase, you can kind of slow down a little bit, and then your mind goes on to like autopilot, because you know all the tips and tricks from here to make something look nice. And this is the fun part. And you may be thinking, well, Tim, this might be fun for you, but I really enjoy doing the line art aspect. I'm not comfortable with doing this aspect of it yet. But I'm telling you, if you just keep practicing, this will become so much more enjoyable, because you will feel so confident going into the coloring stage because of how solid and great your line work is. And honestly, once you get into that position where you're just as comfortable doing your line art as you are doing the rendering, you're just going to be a phenomenal artist, because being so strong in both areas is definitely a rarity, it seems, especially with digital artists, where it definitely seems like you have a strength in one over the other. So now back to the drawing, I'm pretty much at the phase where I'm going through and I'm doing kind of a detail pass on everything. So I'm looking at areas that look just a little sloppy or a little unfinished, and I'm trying to clean them up to the best of my ability at this stage. Where later on I might do like the final polish, where I might like do some touches on the highlights, but here's the phase where I really wanted to make it look nice and have all my values read accurately. And this is the point where you really have to look at your piece with a discerning eye, and you have to really be like, okay, does this look accurate? Does this look sloppy? And then clean it up. You can't just take the lazy route and be like, well, it looks good enough, because then you're only hurting yourself in the long run. So definitely do your best and try to fix it to the best of your ability. And if you get really frustrated, just work on a different piece or walk away from it for a little while and come back to it. And now here I'm doing most of the polishing, or starting the polishing phase, where I'm adding a multiply layer, really toning up those values. and then I'll clean it up from here on then. So unfortunately, I lost the last 20 minutes of the recording, but as you can see, I just added some more final touches and cleaned it up, like the glasses and the lace at the bottom of the hem of the dress. And although the line art is completely covered up, you can still tell that Kent's original line work that he provided kind of shines through this concept. So I hope you guys can make that transition as well, and it'll be so much more fun to color over your line work once you do. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you learned something.